I want to say welcome and thank you for coming on behalf of the Shorenstein Center and our fearless director, Nancy Gibbs. Today, we're going to have a really interesting conversation. One of the things that most people know about me, Joan Donovan, is that I'm the research director at the Harvard Kennedy Shorenstein Center. The other thing people know about me is I talk a lot about disinformation. But a little known fact is that I am obsessed with internet infrastructure. I love all the tubes and wires and the conversations about protocols. And for me, this has been putting together this little event mostly for our alumni and some invited guests, is to discuss a bit about where we've been and where we might go with the possibilities of a public interest internet. Now, for today, if you want to engage with folks, you can use the Q&A function or chat directly to Liz, who will then get the questions to me and I can read them out. I'm not actually seeing the Q&A function. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I don't see that function. Anyway. So if you chat to Liz Schwartz, who's our communications director, you'll be able to ask a question of our guests today. And we will begin by having a couple of comments from our guests, and then we will move into the Q&A. Hopefully those comments will answer every single question you've ever had about the Federal Communications Commission, and we'll never have to talk about it again, right? No. Unfortunately, this is one of those three-letter agencies that is incredibly instrumental in how we get information, not just online, but across all of our different conduits. And one of the things that I loved in doing prep for this was getting to know Chairman Wheeler and Chairman Copps and Commissioner Copps as we were talking about where the FCC has been and where it might go. And so today's conversation is going to be with Chairman Wheeler and Commissioner Copps discussing what is this current moment of tech regulation? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the kinds of resistances new regulators might face? And where should they aim some of their resources and energy? Before we get started, we're going to have Tom Wheeler do his comments first, but I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to him. He was appointed chairman by President Barack Obama in November of 2013. And he was also the former chairman and president for the Foundation of the National Archives, the nonprofit organization dedicated to telling the American story through its documents, and a former board member of PBS. This little detail I really enjoyed. He's the only person to be selected to both the Cable Television Hall of Fame and the Wireless Hall of Fame. And President Obama joked that made him the Bo Jackson of telecom. And I have to say, Bo Jackson was a world wonder. Not many people remember him in particular, but he was one of those sports players that really just knew how to play a game. And so that I really loved that reference. But prior to joining the FCC, Chairman Wheeler was also the managing director at Core Partners, which is a venture capital firm investing in the early stages of internet protocol-based companies. Again, really nerdy stuff. Following that, he was the CEO of several high-tech companies, including the first company to offer high-speed delivery of data to home computers and the first digital video satellite service. Again, stuff you would never, no one's going to be the hero of the day delivering high-speed data. Nevertheless, such an important fact of our lives that we do have high-speed data in our homes, and essentially that I can run a whole television studio right out of my house. And I do want to mention also, though, that Chairman Wheeler has a recent piece in Time, which we'll put in the chat, which is titled "Facebook Says It Supports Internet Regulation. Here's an ambitious proposal that might actually make a difference." And We also have a paper on Shorenstein that we can circulate related to potential proposals around what kind of agency might be necessary to address our information crisis. Second, but by no means in second place, of course, is Commissioner Copps, who was a former Shorenstein Fellow in 2013. So thank you for that. He was sworn in for his first term as commissioner on May 31st, 2001, and then served all the way through end of year in 2011. And he was the chairman in 2009. Also served as the chief of staff for Senator Fritz Hollings for 12 years. And then as he has gone on in his career from the FCC, I have had the pleasure of meeting Commissioner Copps as a board member of Free Press. And I know that Commissioner Copps has been doing a lot of public service work, as well as work with different nonprofits, as well as other advocacy organizations about defending the public interest. So I'm very excited today to talk about what it means to have a public interest internet and a public interest communication system. So now that I've spoken as much as I would like to speak for the duration of this, we're going to hand it over for about 10 minutes. And I say a strong 10 minutes, Tom, because I am a moderator today. And so, but I would love for you to address, how did we end up in this situation, and take the long bird's eye view of how we ended up in this situation with a kind of information crisis that we have not seen in quite a long time, not just because we have more information than ever, but that we are kind of wading through a distribution problem related to having less of the good stuff and more of the bad stuff. And would love to hear what your experience has been, both on the side of the government side of the house, and then on the research and advocacy side of the conversation. So I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Joan. It's great to be with you, and it's always a privilege to associate myself with Commissioner Copps, the great work that he's done over the years, not only on the commission, but everything that he's done since he's left as a public advocate. So let me go back and do some history here, Joan, that kind of underpins the situation we're in today. The last time that we saw some kind of a revolutionary communications technology was the introduction of broadcasting. And in 1949, the FCC stepped up and imposed what was called the Fairness Doctrine, that required that broadcasters provide airtime for controversial topics that were in the public interest and air competing views. It's worthwhile to think, why was that done, and put it in historical context. 1949, World War II had just ended. Everybody was very sensitive to the fact that Hitler had been so successful in harnessing radio, and we're now worried about what the impact of the spread of communism and the concern about the spread of communism would be, and whether that could be done again in this country the way Hitler did it. Therefore, let's make sure that we have open dialogue about all points of view on an issue and not let somebody capture that. It's an interesting situation. It sounds like it comes awful close to the First Amendment, but the Supreme Court ruled in the Red Lion case that because broadcasting was using the public's airwaves, that it had a public interest obligation, and the public had the right to insist that their airwaves were not captured by one side or another. And that policy held until 1987, and the Reagan administration and their deregulation push. The chairman at that point in time, Mark Fowler, said there's nothing different between a radio and a television and a toaster. That TV is just a toaster with pictures. And the FCC, by a unanimous vote of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, voted to repeal the Fairness Doctrine. And Congress came back almost immediately and passed legislation saying, no, we'll put the Fairness Doctrine back in place. And Ronald Reagan vetoed it. And then there was another effort made 3 or 4 years later in Congress, and George H.W. Bush announced, don't waste your time because I'll veto it. And the absence of the Fairness Doctrine gave rise to conservative talk radio. And I'm sure, an experience that Mike can associate himself with, whenever you go through now the confirmation process in the Senate to be chairman of the FCC, all the Republicans are always asking you, you're not going to repeal the Fairness Doctrine, right? So how does that relate to today? Well, the Supreme Court decision, as I said, was based on spectrum and the use of the airwaves. That does not apply to cable networks, and that does not apply to online. I'm also not sure that the current Supreme Court would reaffirm the red line case anyway. But there are 3 issues I think that are relevant today, and then I'll turn it over to Mike and he can talk about the public interest aspects of this. But coming out of that history, 3 things that we ought to be aware of that are happening right now. One is, you'll recall that Donald Trump tried to get the FCC to become a ruler, to make decisions on whether or not the decisions being made, the editorial decisions being made by online services were in good faith, the so-called Section 230 discussion. And fortunately, he left office before that was able to take root. But what did take root and is still at the commission today is a general counsel's opinion that says that the FCC has jurisdiction to interpret the expansion of Section 230 and its determination as to good faith to almost anything the commission regulates, including broadcasters, for instance. So that's kind of point 1. Point 2 is that we have seen in the present Supreme Court what Justice Kagan calls the weaponization of the First Amendment. That the First Amendment has become something that the corporate interests have turned to their own interest. Justice Kavanaugh, when he was a member of the DC Circuit and sitting to review the 2015 net neutrality rules that we passed, said in his opinion that they were a violation of the First Amendment and the right of internet service providers to speak. Now, he was overruled. He was the minority in that 2-1 decision, but he's now, as you know, sitting on the Supreme Court. And at the same point in time, we have cable television. They were out defending themselves against some state laws, arguing that they have a First Amendment right to determine what channels go on the cable system. And that'll probably work its way to the Supreme Court at some point in time. And then relating that to social media, within the last 2 weeks, we have an opinion from Justice Thomas talking about how social media should be like a common carrier, like a telephone company. First come, first serve, non-discriminatory access. In other words, there is no curatorial function at all. So what we're living through right now is a situation where we have a new technology. The previous experience we had was based on spectrum and doesn't seem applicable. And we're trying to figure out, how do we work our way through this and figure out how to come up with rules in an environment where the curatorial function no longer exists, but has been outsourced to citizens who have no curatorial skills or training. And what's the role of government in that? How do we have a public interest decision in this new means of communication called the internet? And we end up with a situation where we have democratized speech. Anybody can speak, but it has had the effect of de-democratizing the country, because it has allowed the country to splinter into multiple groups. We all go to our tribes. And what we need for democracy to survive is to overcome our tribal instincts and come together in what the founders called our unum. As you so know, the national motto is E pluribus unum. How we get to there is going to be the policy challenge of the next multiple years. And I say multiple years, I bow to my friend Mike and his judgment, but I say multiple years because this is not going to be a quick experience. This is going to be an epic, not a short story. Mike, over to you.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. I just wanted to have a quick reaction to this, and then I'll hand it over to Commissioner Copps. But I just wanted to say, you point to some really important big puzzles, and of course, everybody wants this solved yesterday. And one of the precepts of the education I got around science and technology studies is that we should actually think about this as a process and not a product, right? That we actually have to have ongoing and measured ways of approaching this that, do involve some kind of oversight, protection of people's rights, stuff that, of course, Tom, you've advocated for. And I think one of the major and most interesting aspects of this is around the curatorial function around information, because one of the ways in which social media grew up was this idea that, well, everyone will moderate each other and there'll be some flagging. But what I know from the communities that I look at when I'm in these, very sick and twisted spaces of white supremacists or violent misogynists, is they are not interested in flagging each other. I mean, they're there for that content. And one of the major challenges, of course, when it comes to social media is when that content spills over, when the fringe becomes the mainstream, and those groups are able to use the features of these platforms not only to connect with other groups, but to harass them and to essentially make it impossible for them to carry on their everyday business. And so in that sense, I think we also need to introduce and complicate a notion of the public square here, which is to say that a lot of these companies built their reputation and their brand around this idea that Facebook is the new public square, Twitter's the new public square, YouTube's the new public square. Even YouTube went as far as to call itself a library. Right. Married to a librarian. We cannot do this to them. They've been through enough. But I say that all to say that I agree deeply with this notion of curation being a central problem. And one of the myths, of course, of the way in which we get social media has to do with, that the public square would somehow figure out a way to produce a status quo and a homeostasis, which I don't think we've ever really had. If you go to a public park after dark and you want to go do something with your friends, you want to have your friends' band play, you can't do that in the public square. It's disruptive. And so there are rules everywhere we go. And I think one of the major, almost renaissance moments for the FCC is going to be to figure out what these rules might look like and then how to employ them. And so Commissioner Copps, I'd love to invite you into the conversation here and talk a bit about both your experience. I'm just a geek. I'm just an unfrozen caveman sociologist living up the road from Harvard. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience and the challenges you faced when you were at the FCC for a decade, and also to talk a bit about what you call small d democracy.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Joan and Nancy and Susan and all the folks at the Shorenstein Center. I have nothing but happy memories of the time that I spent there back in 2013. I'm especially pleased to be on here with my friend and buddy, Tom Wheeler, who did such a magnificent job chairing the Federal Communications Commission on so many issues, from broadband to net neutrality to privacy to running the auctions to reaching out and really helping the disabilities communities. He made a wonderful contribution. He and I both have an interest in history, and I was especially happy to have that little history that we were just presented with. I was present for much of the deregulation that took place in our media and telecom environments, having been at the FCC, as you say, for almost 11 years. And I saw so many of the pro-consumer, pro-competitive, public interest rules and guidelines deregulated away. I watched a majority, usually a Republican majority, but not always, deregulate away the pro-competitive parts of the Telecommunications Act. That act comes in for a lot of criticism these days. It was far from a perfect act, but it envisioned a heck of a lot more criticism in telecom than we actually ended up with, thanks to the special interests and the special interest influence at the Federal Communications Commission. And I also witnessed years and years of the FCC majority greenlighting both telecom and media mergers. And I descended to most of this, and I thought maybe we had really reached an inflection point where people would wake up and the commission would wake up to the harms of what was going on. When we got to the Comcast Nbcu merger, which came to the commission, I think in 2009, was finally voted on in 2011. Because here were inklings of a new environment. Here was distribution and content in one merger. Here was vertical and horizontal integration. Here was new media and old media. And it just looked awfully dangerous to me. And I think a lot of people around the country thought it was dangerous too. Unfortunately, none of those people occupied chairs at the Federal Communications Commission, and the merger passed with me being the only person who dissented to that. So mergers continue, companies become more and more powerful, and they become more and more alike to one another as their functions and business plans merge. My primary interest in all of this, as you mentioned, Joan, is the effect on our democracy. No company should have in a democracy the ability to wield so much power as we confer on companies right now, and the impact on our news and information infrastructure and on our civic dialogue in both traditional media and in new media has really undermined that dialogue. It's flooded us with infotainment and disinformation and misinformation, and been a major cause for the collapse of true investigative journalism in this country of ours. Today, a lot of the focus and what we'll be talking on is how to prepare what went wrong on the network while keeping all of those vital things that are right. How do we get public interest media? Today, we're going to talk about how you get a public interest internet. There are no silver bullets. You know, there are people out there right now, well, let's just reform Section 230 and that'll take care of our problems, or let's just reinstitute net neutrality or Title II classification. Let's have more transparency. Let's really enforce antitrust. And all of those would help. Each one of them, of course, is a battle royal that, like you say, is going to take years, Tom, because the obstacles put in the way of reforms by business and by Congress and by the courts are so substantial. So if you go at this at a one at a time focus, that will take us to the 12th of never. And as Johnny Mathis used to croon, that's a long, long time. The good news is we have a new administration, an administration willing to look at the possibilities of the future rather than at the collapsed verities of the past. And soon I hope we will have a public interest majority at the Federal Communications Commission, opening the way to accomplish good things like Tom accomplished when he was our chair. The interim chairwoman there, Jessica Rosenworcel, used to work with me. She's great with her knowledge and experience. She could help open the doors to a good new future, great new future at the FCC. So yeah, there are things we can do soon. We can and we should act on Title II and net neutrality. And I'm delighted to see all the talk about broadband and money going into broadband and getting broadband out to every single household in this country. I have long said it's a civil right. You cannot be a functioning citizen in this country of ours without access to it. So hopefully we will progress. But this internet of ours is so vast and so encompassing and so full of potential and so many challenges that it really needs a more comprehensive approach. Some people are saying, well, we need a new agency. It's a big deal. Let's just set up a new agency. And that might be a good idea, but you know, you got to learn from history. I remember when we set up the Department of Homeland Security, it was very messy. It didn't really work all that great for a long, long time. So you'd have to be careful on that, and whether Congress, as currently composed, has the ability and the competence to do that. I don't know in this polarized world. And then if we do that, how do we harmonize what the new agency does with what the old agencies do, the Federal Communications Commission, the FTC, on issues that cross-cut all three? Do we have one set of policies for our news and information infrastructure? Or do we have three of them? I don't know. Is there an old media and a new media and never the twain shall meet? I hope not. So I think we ought to try to tackle the challenge of internet redemption, as I call it, holistically. And I've suggested a White House task force or a commission, time limited to a year, just to look at the future of the internet, come up with some recommendations. Very importantly, to ask the right questions. You know, people run around with all the answers now. We don't even know that we're answering the right questions when we talk about the impact of the internet and artificial intelligence and the future for jobs and health and humanity generally. So a time-limited commission, cross-cutting, business, small business, academia, public interest groups, labor, innovators, entrepreneurs, and regular citizens too. And I like putting it at the White House level because that confers visibility. And maybe we can even get the media to be interested in encouraging a national dialogue. Everybody has an interest in this, and there should be outreach as we go about it. So, you know, it just reminds me of the old story, the blindfolded person, people looking at the elephant. And I touch the elephant and everybody sees a different part you got to work on or fix or whatever. When it comes to the internet, it's time to look at the whole beast. And it's time to get a handle on it and look holistically at it. There's other things I'd like to talk about. Maybe we will, like media literacy. I hope we can pursue that a little bit because it's so much a part of the solution too. But the final thing I want to say is just remind everybody that the goal of informing ourselves so that we can intelligently conduct the affairs that we are expected to conduct in a self-governing society. It's not new. It's not a new challenge for the internet age. It's something that's been with us going back to the early days of the Republic. I always repeat a quote most of you have heard from James Madison: "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." And he concluded, "A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. And I hope we will approach our challenges with the internet with that kind of a goal in mind and figure out how this internet, so much a part of our lives, can really serve and advance the public interest. The end.
So Joan, can I pile on here for a second? I think Mike has raised some really good points, but I also think I want to respond to what you put out.
Yes, let me just give a few comments about what Mike has said, and then I will turn it over to you, because I think it draws together some of the relevant issues, which has a lot to do with how the past shapes the future, which is to say that we're not on some kind of technologically determinist, innovation path where things are going to keep evolving with the internet and we're just going to struggle to keep up. Sometimes technology, of course, is faster than regulation. And that has a lot to do with just the way in which these systems work and how pragmatic, I would say, regulators have been. And some might interpret that as slow. But one of the things that you bring up, Mike, that really, sticks with me every time I struggle with the disinformation question and why it's become so big and so vast and so lumbering. One of them is because of access, which is that access to the internet, I agree with you, is a civil right, but also we make the case in our research that access to the truth is also a civil right. It's also a human right. And that's if you get one without the other, right? If you get access to the internet, but without a strong commitment to truth, like what we have within news agencies and our educational system, what you end up with is a whole big lumbering mess of cheap and easy and free information. And some of that, of course, to become profitable is disinformation. And it really makes me think about this quote from the Comcast acquisition of NBC, where you were the only one who seemed to be against it. And you said at that time, at the end of the day, the public interest requires much more than it's receiving. The Comcast NBC Universal joint venture opens up the door to the cableization of the open internet, the potential for walled gardens, toll booths, content prioritization, access fees to reach end users, and a stake in the heart of independent content production is now very real. And I just think that that's so important for us to mark as this moment in 2011, right before we get, of course, the Egyptian revolution, before we get Occupy Wall Street and all of these other different ways in which movements have come to adapt to and adopt the internet. But at the same time, even though you have a bunch of different, what we might call pro-social changes happening as a result of access to the internet and social media, this other stuff still goes on. These mergers, these acquisitions, the consolidation of power in the information ecosystem. This is how Facebook scaled, right? Is because a lot of people were kind of enamored by and enchanted by the possibility of these platforms as services to replace the public square and bring more democracy, not less. And so, Tom, I'd love to get your reaction to that and to the conversation thus far.
Well, thanks, Joan. I think there's the point you just made is an excellent point. I want to go back, and I'll come back to the point you just made, but I want to go back to your first point that you had in the buffer between Mike and me. And you talked about the fallacy of the old line that the solution for bad information is more information. And I'm not sure that holds anymore. And I think it doesn't hold when the drive for profits and the drive for political power both come from the same source, which is the fractionalizing of the unum in e pluribus unum. And that, in fact, you talked about the town square. What we're experiencing is the tragedy of the commons. We all know that something that is without oversight ends up becoming a mud pit. And that's what we're seeing with the internet. Now, to go to the point that you just made, hey, look, the quality of information, the quality of competition, the dominance that a handful of companies have over the asset of the 21st century, which is data, all go together to create this tragedy of the commons. And just like, you know, in the Cambridge Town Square, which is not too far from the Shorenstein Center, they had to put rules in place to make sure that it wasn't overgrazed and abused by its openness. We need to have basic rules and understanding that says, this is how you will behave. And we probably need to think about a new way of how we get to those rules. That is not the old regulatory model that Mike and I are used to and used to have to live with and enforce, that tends to be rigid and sclerotic, but a new structure that recognizes that the internet itself has introduced a new structure to everything, distributing activity. And how do we take advantage of that to come up with new structures and new codes? And that goes back to, I saw that it was posted on the chat, that goes back to the work that we've been doing at the Shorenstein Center, Phil Revere and Gene Kimmelman and myself, on this idea of a new agency, and not just a new agency, but a new approach to how you govern.
I want to introduce one complicating, piece of this tragedy of the commons argument, which is to say that there will always be more for the rich and the powerful. And the issue with when we introduce the commons here as well is the same thing that we see with the platform companies, is they've taken more than their fair share, especially when it comes to centralizing communications. I mean, I gasped when I heard Zuckerberg describe Facebook as decentralized. That doesn't make any sense, right? And the point of the internet itself as the infrastructure, right, which is still there, that you can have an internet without having Facebook. And I think that's something that sometimes we forget, because of the way in which in other countries they have become that kind of infrastructure of communications in a way that is kind of they become much more profitable and powerful when they control everything from the hardware all the way up through the data and the communication infrastructure of the actual product itself of social media. But with the tragedy of the commons, and this has been something that throughout my career I've really wanted to hang on to, and I think, Mike, you're going to have a really interesting comment about this, which is to say that how do we ensure that people who don't have representation, who do not have money or voice or power in that same way that others do, potentially to lobby Congress to get the rules that they want in place, how do we ensure that their interests are represented and that they are able to have both access to communication technology at a very low to free cost and access to the truth? Because the issue with the commons has always been is that if you make the rules about what counts as the commons and what is in common, then you can often engineer it to be to your advantage. And so, Mike, I'd love to get your reflections on, in this moment, how do we ensure that something like a public interest internet would serve the many and not just...
I don't know there's any way to ensure. A couple of comments. First of all, I don't think it's just the tragedy of the commons. I think it's the tragedy of our whole communications, particularly our news and information infrastructure. And that's why we have to have solutions that are cross-cutting. As I said, if you have a new agency, how do you harmonize all of that? I understand what Tom is saying about, maybe the solution for bad news isn't necessarily more news. On the other hand, what it takes in a self-governing society is facts, truth, bringing journalism back, trying to find a model for online journalism. One doesn't exist now. We know that just according to the New York Times, we've closed So we had a newspaper since the last 2 years and lost 600 more journalists. We probably lost half of our newsroom jobs since the beginning of the century. What we have lost in the way of traditional news media has no way been picked up by new media, because there just aren't that kind of numbers, or is there that kind of a model online for it. But now to go to your question, how to get people involved? Well, first of all, you inform people. I went and work with Common Cause a little bit now as a special advisor on media and democracy reform. And a lot of what we've done there, and a lot of what I did with the FCC, was grassroots outreach and going out and talking to people. And when I was at the FCC, taking the FCC out to talk to people. So the prerequisite for that democracy that we want to go towards is, first of all, have investigative journalism, fact, not just opinion and bloviating, and then an informed citizenry. Now, how do you do that? This takes a while, although I think you both agree that this is the process, as you said, Joan, and it's going to take a long time to solve all of these problems. We need to get serious in this country about media or digital literacy. And I know when you mentioned that, people are like, oh God, that's 20 years, 30 years, you've got to change the curriculum in all of our schools, you've got to train educators and teachers and all of that. But I think we can start now. When I was at the FCC, I suggested to a chairman, not current chairman here, who I didn't get to serve with, that maybe we ought to be pushing for a K through 12, just for openers, a K through 12 literacy program. So many groups and organizations, there might be people on this meeting today who have done work on media literacy. And I've put together little pieces. And if someone like the FCC or the White House, would be even better, came along and said, let's get the private sector and the public sector in a room. Let's share what we've got here. Let's put together a K through 12 online media literacy program that we can make available to school districts around the United States of America. School district doesn't want to do it, fine. You're not going to force it down their throat. I think a lot of them would. But there's something at every level in the education cycle, from K through 12, to interest youngsters from, this is the internet, hello, this is how you use it. This is how you do your homework. This is how you find a trustworthy site and how you find out who's not trustworthy, and it goes on and on and on. And I think we could do that within a year or so. If it would have some leadership and put it online, it would be constantly evolving, constantly getting better. And then meanwhile, you address that larger challenge that I talked about. How do you make room for all of this in a curriculum? How do you have teachers that are really capable of conducting it? So that's one of the things that I feel extremely strong about. And I don't think we should see it as just a far off goal, but I see it as something we can start as quickly as we can settle 230 or privacy legislation or things like that. Let's be about the job.
I love to hear it. We have a question in the chat from John Palfrey that's very much in this line of asking, we've talked a lot about different things that might happen. Is there one thing we might start doing first? And it sounds like your answer to that would be to say, let's get on some of this media literacy. Let's help people understand more about the information environment. Let's add context to how people use the internet so that they can start to do some of this work of understanding the difference between the New York Times and two kids with a backpack and a blog, right? And I think that one of the things that I've always tried to think about in terms of how we might solve for some of the disinformation problem is what's been really irksome over the years is how good disinformers and media manipulators have gotten at cloaking and doing imposter engagement, so as to make sure that when you're looking up something like even today J&J vaccine, you are going to encounter as much misinformation as you are going to encounter accurate information, or the kind of information that is just unfortunately true, which is we don't know a lot right now, which is to say that science takes time. But I'd love to get your opinion on this question, Tom, about, is there something you would suggest that we might want to kick off now so that we can tee up some of these other interventions? I'm very much in Mike's camp of let's do all the things, because I realize that all of them are going to happen on different timescales and are going to require different kinds of resources. But for you, Tom, where's the starting point?
Well, I think Mike is absolutely right that we have to have an informed public capable of being their own curators. But I think that's one piece of the puzzle. The problem is that even a well-trained curator is going to have a hard time dealing with a runaway freight train. And that's what we're living through right now, is this runaway freight train of information. And so, what has been absent in this? And let's go back again to a historical reality. Innovators always make the rules until they begin to infringe on the rights of individuals and the public interest. And then there is a reason to step in and create rules in the public interest. It's in the Gilded Age, we had the robber barons, they were making all the rules. Finally, the government stepped in. We've got, in the internet age, a similar kind of a situation. Move fast and break things is another way of saying move fast before they catch on to what we're doing and try to do something about it. And so we need to be not only having good citizens, but we need to be creating expectations for what is the proper behavior of the companies that are providing internet service and those that are providing platforms on top of that service. And it's fascinating to me that the internet was built through a process of developing technical standards. How did we get from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G? The industry all came together and they said, well, we're going to take this technology and put it with this technology and keep moving forward. But where are the behavioral standards? And why can't we come up with a structure where we establish the behavioral standards for the technology that was developed by a similar standards process? And I think government has to have a role in that. And I think industry has to have a role in that. The public has to have a role in that. But somebody other than the companies needs to start making the rules.
No,
we need
go ahead, Michael.
We need structural rules and we need behavioral rules, and both of those is what the FCC has been busy dismantling and getting rid of. I'm not arguing that we can create Roman citizens well informed on every issue and experts in the town square of democracy paved with broadband bricks. But we certainly can, with some structural rules, some behavioral rules, coming up with a model for online journalism and restoring some of the public interest obligations of traditional media. We certainly can. We certainly can come up with better than we have now, and with a sufficiently informed citizenry and electorate that can make better decisions for the future of the country than we've been making for the last quite a few years now.
Well, this is where, one of the big things that I've been researching and trying to assess is who's really paying for misinformation at scale, right? And for me, it's always been trying to assess the last several years, where are the harms, what are the impacts, what are the resource losses? Of course, we've seen in journalism as well, an enormous amount of energy spent on developing this disinformation beat in order to protect the public from misinformation that is reaching millions of people online before it has been removed. Years of fighting these companies on descaling misinformation. And it's all led me to try to think about this as a need for extending the public interest obligations to our news feeds and timelines, right? And so that the kind of stuff that doesn't go viral, the timely, local, accurate, relevant information is not easily accessible, especially when it's mixed in a sea of political disinformation. I'll give you one example from 2020, which was that in the moments of people trying to figure out how to vote during the pandemic, if you were to search for mail-in voting, you would have been barraged with propaganda before you would have seen anything that would help you figure out where to vote and how to get your ballot. And for me, that's the stakes here, which is to say that people need to be able to access accurate information on demand, and that the ways in which we've been talking about this problem over the last hour really point to this need for access to accurate information. And unfortunately, accurate information is very expensive to produce. I work at a university. Many of my friends are journalists. It is not cheap to produce facts. And we do have to face that reality as we face this moment that, in a way, as you were talking about, Tom, back, thinking about why we ended up with laws about public interest obligations around bandwidth, right? Maybe bandwidth isn't the thing. Maybe, we have limited bandwidth on radio, but we obviously are not going to be able to make that case for the internet because there's unlimited space, it seems. However, I do think that we do have some kind of duty to the public to ensure that these companies, as they grow big and lumbering and centralize much of our journalism, much of our access to information, become access points to information, that we do need to introduce, and I think this is where the behavioral standards piece comes in, a set of a code of conduct and even to extend into auditing and oversight of algorithms, which algorithms are very dumb. They just rank and sort information and then distribute it. They're not these kind of mythical beasts that can do everything that companies say they can. But I'd love to get you both of your final thoughts on if we were to take up the charge of a public interest internet very seriously, if we were to try to move on getting a task force together at the White House level, ideally, but somewhere else is okay too. What are for you, talk from your own perspective as having done this work, what would help the FCC get the job done, right? How can journalists and researchers and the public and our advocacy world, how can we all get involved and pitch in?
Well, there's lots of different ways I could think of. We haven't talked about the role of public media, either in traditional media or online media today. I mentioned the absence of a model. Maybe there's a role for the public media. Maybe there should be a much larger role for it. Maybe the commercial infrastructure of commercial businesses can't get us out of the mess that we're in, and we have to look more and more at public media. I want to throw in a subversive idea, though, that builds on what Joan just said about it's the scarcity, and Tom mentioned this too, the scarcity of airways. It just strikes me as odd, and I know this is the regnant jurisprudence right now, that when we're talking about our nation's need for news and information and informed civic dialogue, and a need that goes back to recognition by the founding fathers, the best we can come up with in the courts as well, there's scarce airwaves. And I think we should begin to realize that news and information, national dialogue are important to public safety. They're important to national security, the sustenance of democracy, and aren't they sufficiently important as rationales for a public interest internet? I also find it interesting if you look at Title I of the Communications Act, where it talks about how the FCC will have jurisdiction over radio and wires. You know, I don't know what else is out there but radio and wires. Telecom uses it, broadcast uses it, wireless uses it, fiber's a wire. I know this isn't going to change the Supreme Court's mind overnight, but I think we ought to have a discussion on it. And I would also add, you know, we talk about the plenitude of resources. We have not everybody has broadband. There's a scarcity of broadband around this country of ours. Look at the auctions that Tom ran and they currently run. People are paying a lot of money to get access to this stuff. Maybe there's still scarcity. Who knows?
I love it, Tom.
So
what about
really
you?
quickly, I realize we're running out of time here.
Time? What is that? Come on.
Yeah, well, it's all relative.
We're just buddies
right?
on Zoom, okay?
So you know, you asked about the job of a regulator and how you would approach it as that. I don't know how Mike felt about it, but I felt that my experience as chairman was at about 8 o'clock every morning, somebody would open my office door and move one of those tennis ball machines that goes thump, 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 and just keeps throwing balls at you, right?
Yeah.
And you were constantly responding, forehand or backhand or whatever it may be, to that constant barrage and never getting a chance to say, wait a minute, whoa, let's back up, let's think. And so the important thing that the Shorenstein Center is doing, the important thing that this discussion does is to back off without that kind of incessant pressure and say, okay, is there a way we can look at this? And it seems to me that when you do that, you come up with the basic four corners of a concept into which what Mike's been talking about and what you've been talking about, Joan, and what I've been talking about all fit. And that goes back to basic common law concepts that we've had for hundreds of years. And that's the duty of care and the duty to deal. That the duty of care says that when you offer a product, you have a responsibility to anticipate the adverse consequences of the use of that product and mitigate them.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we see that existing on the internet today? And the duty to deal says that for an essential service, you cannot, or essential asset, you cannot withhold that. And so that becomes a competitive issue. Okay, that becomes withholding assets that are necessary to compete. The duty of care becomes a consumer protection issue. And we have to say, okay, inside the four corners of those concepts, which are only hundreds of years old and we have applied in so many instances, we ought to be able to come up with a set of rules and expectation and behavioral practices for this new technology. And that's the kind of questions and expectations that we ought to be establishing. And again, I go back to, that's one of the great things that Shorenstein Center has been doing, is allowing folks to focus on the development of those kinds of ideas.
Well, I appreciate it. We do love to carve out space for anyone and everyone that wants to think big about the tubes and wires. And Mike, your idea was adorably subversive because I'm right there with you. I do think we need to rethink, you know, the basis on which we make these arguments, because I do believe that, of course, a public interest internet is possible. And we do, you know, for me, in closing, I would say that one of the things that I've been inspired by is a few representatives in Congress are starting to think about the tech industry like we used to think about banking during the era of Glass-Steagall, which is to say that what aspects of the tech stack, if you are in business, say in hardware, should you be in the app store? If you're in social media, should you be selling advertising? And all of this has to do with consumer protections, of course, and the way in which both our civil rights get violated, as well as price fixing, frankly, happens as a result of companies that are able to scale completely unabated from the realities that the rest of us face, which is we cannot simply turn this off. This is our economy. This is our entertainment. This is our social life. This is the internet, love it or tolerate it, is something that is an incredible innovation, and it's up to our generation to try to rein in some of the worst use cases and bring it into the service of the people, right? Technology shouldn't be something that rules us. It should be something, of course, that we can harness to our benefit. With that being said, I just want to say this was a real treat for me, career highlight. I mean, not every day I get to hang out with a couple of folks that were commissioner chairmans of the FCC. And so thank you for spending this time with me at Shorenstein.
Thank you, Joan.
And
Thank you very much.
thank you. And
Great.
Nancy, did you want to say any closing words? Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah, there we go. Gotcha.
Just to add my thanks. It's so helpful to us to have the perspective that you bring as we think through this work. And so I really appreciate the time and the insight and the experience that you bring, and the fact that you're still asking. I mean, Mike talks about you have to ask the right questions, that you're still not just providing answers, that you are still raising new questions. So thank you for making all of us smarter.
Love it. Well, thank you, Nancy, for letting me work here. Always a wild ride. And for all the alumni that came back, so good. So good to see y'all, and hopefully space and place we'll be together again.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Joan, Nancy.
Thank you.